very first thing, welcome back. Welcome back, guys. You all know where the toilets are and all that. We don't need to go over any of that stuff. And we're going to do some feedback. We'll take a little break, do a little bit more, have lunch. After lunch, I'm giving a speech, and you're all invited to come because it relates to you. It's about maintenance in the home and kids and using the youth. And then after that, we're coming back here where you get certificates, and you don't want to go away before that last show because there's a whole pile of toolboxes in the back with your name on it, okay? And if you ain't here, it's going to be hard to get it to you, okay? So you don't want to sneak out at the end. So what I want to get back from you at this point, we went into this, we weren't sure how it was going to go. You saw us farting around. You saw us doing it one way here on Tuesday. Then we decided that's too slow, so we changed it for the show in there. That was great for me. We got practice, and we were able to do it quickly. We did less, but we did it quickly there. And so I want feedback from you. I know you don't like to talk, so I'll make you a deal, is that I speak too fast, and you speak too soft. Because you're all like that. You're going to talk like this and then nobody can hear you, and then it's like, and I'm hard of hearing on top of it. So I'll make a deal. I'll slow down if you'll speak up. And I think that we've been together long enough now and had some interesting experience. I really need some feedback from you about how it went, because we're doing other sessions like this eventually, and it's always hard to figure out what it is we should be doing, how we do it, and whether you feel like it was worthwhile. Would you get involved in it? If that table's too tight, we can move the whole table forward if you want to. Let me take the coffee. Don't spill the water. That'll be easier. So, first of all, I know some of you, I actually told me that you felt like you learned something. Is that, anybody learn something? Yeah. Raise a hand. It's like the speaker at the night. You weren't there for the speaker, but hey, I see the profs are raising their hand. That's a good sign when a prof will admit that he doesn't know. I learn things every time I come and do a thing like this, because somebody comes up to me and says, well, you know, there's another way to do it. And I look at it and I say, well, I don't really like that way, but you're right. There's another way to do it. In fact, that's one of the things to keep in mind if you ever get involved in really doing renovations or construction, is in construction and housing, there are a lot of right ways to do it and a few wrong ways. But normally the argument's over two right ways. The question you have to answer, and is related very much to what you're seeing going on up here, is where do you live? Because sometimes the right way is related to climate. It's related to how much snow you get, how much water you get, how much ice you get. And that changes how it goes. For instance, in Quebec, we do not follow the National Building Code on roofs. Our building code is much stiffer because we have the heaviest snow in all of Canada. You guys get more snow up here than we do, but it's light. It's real humid in Montreal, and so our snow is extremely heavy. And so it's worse on the roofs, so our roofs are stronger than any other roof in Canada. So things do change. So you take a plan off the internet that comes from Arizona. Ah, look at this great plan. I love this. Or a machine that was made for the Arizona climate, and you bring it up to Canada. It may not even work. It may freeze up. We've had a lot of heat pumps that were brought in from the United States, and they just froze. And they froze up as soon as it started getting a little bit cold because they didn't know what cold was. And so we had to change the rules, and we made heat pump rules for Canada. So there's a CSA designation of how a heat pump can be sold in Canada, because it has to be sold to function at minus 20 degrees or more. And they're not all that way. So a lot of things vary by temperature, even your glues. If you're using adhesive, read the label. And when you read the label, you'll find out what are the limits on temperature. Some glues you can use down to -15, -20. Other glues, you got to stop at 0. You're going to be real tight there. Now, back to your experience with this. You learned how the jigsaw. Anything particular about the jigsaw that stuck in your mind? Have you ever used a jigsaw before this week? You have. Who else? You've used it. You've used it. 3, 4, 5, a lot of them. What did I teach you new? Anything?
Plunge cut.
What?
Plunge cut.
The plunge cut. How to sneak that in, slide it forward. Okay. Anything else? Yes?
Flooring.
Flooring?
Like where you do that tile.
You do the tile.
Or is that it's that like little corner piece?
Oh, the molding.
Yeah.
The molding. So doing that and then coping, using the jigsaw a little bit, but then coping the rest. Okay, that I assumed was new to everybody because coping is something that the pros do all the time. And quite frankly, if you were working next to somebody with experience, they'd probably say, why are you doing that with a pencil? Because if you cut the molding in a certain way, it leaves you a line. It leaves you a lot of scrap wood to cut off, but it leaves you the drawing of the profile where to cut. But that's one thing about jigsaws. Jigsaw is not a commonly used tool in construction sites. It's used more in renovation because we're cutting things out that are small. But the reason I emphasize the jigsaw in all my initial training, it's less expensive as a tool. You can get cheap ones and they work. The difference between a good DeWalt like we were using or a cheap jigsaw is just how long it lasts. But they both do the same job. The good DeWalt has more adjustment to it, and we didn't get into doing angles and bevels and stuff like that. But, and the cheap one is a little harder to do like that. But they all can accomplish the same work. But the fact of the matter is, the jigsaw can do almost any job you want in a house. It's just a heck of a lot slower than other tools. So a circular saw, you cut it. I can make the same cut with the jigsaw. So if you're building a shelf at home and you don't have a circular saw, because not many of you do, and you don't have a miter saw, so what do? You get the jigsaw. But how do we get the jigsaw to work? We didn't really do much of that, but if I take my jigsaw, let me get it out here. Well, one thing is to understand that there are lots and lots of blades available for jigsaws. So even without the blade in here, if I take a jigsaw and I want to cut a straight line, I can clamp this down on my wood and slide the jigsaw along it, and you'll get it as straight as a circular saw, if not better. You got to go smooth and easy, not necessarily rapid, but by using this as a straight edge guide or using your big square as a straight edge guide, or there's a smaller square that I didn't bring here, but it's called a speed square. It's a little triangle. That you know the speed square. You got one, okay. It's a little triangle and it hooks over the edge of the board, and you can use it with a circular saw. You can use it with a jigsaw by sliding along the edge, and you get a straight cut. Straight and square at the same time. So you just need one little mark on your board and away you go. Okay? So a jigsaw can do a lot, but it has a problem that if you're going to go on a countertop up to the wall, there's still an inch left over. So then either you got to do something else, it could be a handsaw, or you get artistic. Now this is more tricky. You got to be careful, and you saw by the plunge cut. With the plunge cut, you could actually control it enough to get down into the wood without breaking the blade. Now we have one blade that got bent on Tuesday. Cutting the joists on the side, the guy was doing it, one of you, I don't remember who, did it, and you didn't have the saw flat on the surface. So the saw was going like this, and in a strange angle, and so at one point the blade just bound, and it actually twisted the blade over. Now I'm cheap, so at night I took the blade, I put it on the head of a hammer and took another hammer and tapped it until it was straight. Okay? You can cheat that way. And if you're in a northern community and there ain't no more blades at the store, you've got to make your blades last. Okay, and that can help. In fact, you really want to get carried away with it, you buy yourself a very small file and you can sharpen the blade a little bit. By the way, if you want to sharpen a jigsaw blade, you hold on to it with at least a vice grip. It'd be nice if you had a real vice, but at least a vice grip to hold it tight. You only have to sharpen the first inch that is up against the shoe. The other part we hardly ever use. The part sticking out there, it doesn't hit the wood. It's sticking out the bottom of the piece of wood. So it's the first 10 teeth that get dull. And so if you're cheap like me, you can sharpen that up. Brings me back, since this is a day for stories, I did an apprenticeship of sorts, not a real apprenticeship, but it was working alongside old ancient master craftsman in Japan. And he was restoring Shinto temples. And the only reason I worked with him is I met him in a sushi bar at night, and he was dead drunk and discouraged and depressed because his 5th son was leaving to go to Tokyo to be a computer expert. And the whole line of generations of temple restorers was wiped out. So I looked at this guy. You wonder how I talked to him, because he obviously didn't speak English, is that my girlfriend had studied, was a foreign exchange student in Formosa, so she could write Chinese. And the Japanese is similar to the Chinese in their writing. And I was around long enough that I could speak just a smidgen of Japanese. So with my pidgin Japanese and her Chinese, we actually communicated a bit with this guy. And I said, I'd love to work with you. And he put down his sake and he looked at me with a great big eye. You know, usually they're quite slanted. And great big eyes all around. And he looked at me and he said, you would? And so he gave me an appointment to see him at 6 o'clock the next morning at a temple. And he didn't have a classy job, okay? He was a maintenance man for old temples and dealing with drywall all the time and rot and just things that got loose and were falling down. And so it wasn't like a high-class thing with the fancy saws and all, although he did have some fancy saws. And he worked with a kimono. You know, like you see in the films? He actually worked that way. Now this was, how long ago was that? That was 60 years ago. Okay? So it was a long time ago. But he had these great big sleeves. Somehow he worked and he didn't get them caught. But he had all kinds of things hidden in the sleeves. So there's a rule in Shinto temples. Shinto is the religion of that particular temple. Is that, and it took me a while to understand why the rule existed. But the rule is you can't use any nails or screws. No nails or screws in the whole building. Okay? The entire building was built with joints that was a mortise and tenon. So there's a mortise cut here and a tenon goes into it, but not horizontal. They were always on an angle. And then they would go up 5 stories high. And then they had heavy clay tiles on the roof. You know, these things were kind of round and not very wide, but they kind of like towers going up. And so the thing was, the reason they were built that way from years and years, hundreds of years of tradition, is that was the only structure that survived. Survived what? Survived earthquakes. They always have earthquakes in Japan. And so you would be amazed, and I actually watched this happen once, is that they, with their joints like that, an earthquake hits, everything shakes and moves, and it comes out of the hole a little bit. Now, if it were to come out of the hole with each earthquake, we'd get into trouble. It'd fall apart. So how is it they last 2,000 years? Is that they come out of the hole a little bit, then earthquakes always have aftershocks. So there's the big quake, and then there's little quakes. Well, the little quakes, it'd go back in. Just like your drill bit, your driver bit going back into the socket of the screw yesterday. So they would come out, and then they would go back in, and the thing would stay. The only time they panicked is if the tiles blew off the roof, because the whole thing was counting on it being heavy on the top to get it back in. So if the tiles blew off, the whole village got involved. They had to get those tiles back up there in the middle of the storm, or whatever was going on. But that was a panic. But if no tiles came off, no sweat. So this guy was doing repairs, like a little bit of rot down on a fancy piece of a railing or something like that. And of course, it would be a lot easier to toenail a little nail in there. And the reason the Shinto temple said no fixtures, because if I put a nail into this action here, the action wouldn't work. It would come up and the aftershock wouldn't put it back. So they didn't have any fasteners. They just came up. When they did have horizontal joints, they would pin it with a piece of wood. But that was minor. The major one was the one coming down. So, but despite that, it was just a religious span. Nobody knew why. It took me years after I left Japan to find out about this temple moving business, even though I saw it happen once. I saw it happen and didn't understand it. And then I studied it with the architectural community and things like that and found out that that was a real reason for being. So you'd love this old guy. When he got a sneaky look on his face, he was working like this, and I'm watching him. And then he looks for a priest. There's no priest right, no priest left. And he goes into his little thing. He pulls out this tiny little hammer with a leather head on the hammer head. And I couldn't really talk to him much. We communicated a lot with just grunts. Huh, yes, no, yes, do that. Because we barely understood each other. So I had to really pay attention. But I asked him, what's the leather? And he says, doesn't make noise, no sound. The priest can't hear him. And then he pulls out a finishing nail, a good modern finishing nail. And then he takes a chisel. I don't have a chisel here, but we'll use this for a chisel. Takes a chisel. It was actually a little curved chisel, not the flat ones. And you can do this if you want to in your own work. If you go with the grain, you can slide a chisel into the wood just a little bit, lift it, and if you do it carefully, you don't break the grain. You lift it up just high enough to put a nail in under it, and then you push it back with a little glue, and you've got a plug over the nail, but it's perfect fit because it's the same wood. It's the wood that you did not break off. So you've got to do that with the wood. It's a little flexible. A hardwood, that's hard, but with wood, it's a little flexible. You can do it up. And that's what he did. He popped that up. He put the nail in. He had a tiny little squirt of modern glue, and that was all hidden, so the priest would never see it. And he put a drop of glue on that, push it down, and then he had something that was like our tape. It was more like a gum, almost like bubble gum that he had. He'd put over the top, and he would, before any priest showed up, he'd take that off, but he needed about 10 minutes for the glue to dry. And you couldn't see that this little piece of wood trim was fixed like that. He said, otherwise you'd have to take the whole thing off and build a whole new piece. But he was considered as a miracle worker because he got it all fixed with no working, but it was all hidden. But it's interesting working with people, and if you're thinking about going into and doing trades, you need to work with people, even if you're just volunteering, somebody in the neighborhood, there's some work going on, go over and say, hey, can I be a helper? Don't expect to do a lot of good work, just carry lumber for the guy, but you pay attention to him, okay? There's an old story about apprenticeship that in a woodworking shop once, because I had my own woodworking shop, there were 3 young men who came in and they were given the job of sweeping the floor. That's all they were given to do. And they wanted to be working with wood and at least sanding something. But they were given the job of sweeping the floor at the beginning, and the boss said, we'll see if we keep you or not. And so they swept for about a week, and then finally the boss showed up. And he asked the first guy, he says, how you do? He says, I'm really good, I'm fast. I get it right up into a pile and scoop it in. And of course he has a cloud of dust coming up because he's sweeping hard, okay? He says, no, we don't want you. Let's talk with the next guy. And the next guy also talked about how really good he was, and he was doing a little better than the first guy because he knew that you have to keep a broom on an angle, never up like this where it makes dust. You slide it on an angle like that all the time so the dust doesn't come up. And he says, okay, you've got promise. We'll hang on to you. And then the third guy said, I'm not really good at sweeping very much. And he says, well, why? He says, well, I know I don't want to make a lot of dust and I get it up, but it's too interesting watching the guys that are working. He says, you're hired. He says, because you were spending your time watching what the other guy's doing, trying to learn something. And that's the one he wanted. And that's really a lot about learning how to follow him. A job I had in Montreal, I was a young kid still when I got to Montreal, not as young as you, but about 27, 28 when I got to Montreal. And I got a job, we were working on a second story balcony, and I was working with an old fart. He must have been 40 years old. I mean, when you're 27, no, 40 is an old fart. And I actually think he was about 50, but he was slow. And I was energetic. And so he was working so slow all the time, going along. And I was getting things done and going up and going down. And he didn't seem to ever move. He just moved occasionally a little bit. And at the end of the day, I was tired. He was still just moving at the same speed. And then I said, you know, do you get faster with time or do you slow down with time? He says, I didn't slow down. There was nothing wrong with that. Count how many joists you did and count how many I did. And he actually accomplished one more joist than I did. I was going like crazy, but I was running up and down and I was redoing the work 2 and 3 times because I did it real fast, put the next one in, and then it didn't match. Then I had to undo this one, put it back in, and get it to match. I was backtracking on my work all the time. He just did it right the first time, real slow, real methodically. And I was amazed. I just sat down kind of exhausted. And I said, oh, okay, that's interesting. That's something to think about in terms of not being in a rush. And not being in a rush is what has kept my fingers on. Because getting in a rush, that's where you cut something off. Okay? So back to the jigsaw. How do we come up and get that last little bit up against the wall? And we don't want to go get another saw, and we want to use the jigsaw. Well, you learned it yesterday. You tilt back with your nose touching the wall, so you got control, and you come up real slowly with the blade sticking in, just scratching the wall. And it cuts that last little bit on the way up. You got to be careful, because you could go crazy, you could jump, you could bend the blade, lots of things can go wrong. But if you got the control, and you've really learned to use the tool, you can actually take it and just slide up. Okay, a little bit more. You're sort of sculpturing your way in. Same thing with doing this molding. Jigsaw. How do you get in there when it's really tight? You could get a special blade that's skinnier called a scroll saw that does a better job of going around these shapes than we have. Or you could even do the whole thing going straight in little shots like this, stopping always just a little short, and then come back and finish with the file. And just the little roughness of it, take that out. So there's lots of ways to go, but I just want to drive home that this forsaken little tool that most people consider is not very useful can often be used. In fact, it's often the only tool to do one certain job when it's really small, delicate, and getting around. But for when you have a limited amount of tools, this is one of the first things you buy. If you don't even have a circular saw yet, you buy a jigsaw because it can do all of that. Then you get a circular saw and you're going to use it because it goes faster and it goes straighter. Well, it can also go crooked more further. So you got to learn to get in there. The other thing I hope that you picked up on is the glasses. Because the glasses, often what we're doing, well, a lot of workmen are doing who don't wear glasses, is they try to hide behind their saw so the dust doesn't get them in the face. But that gets your eye in the wrong place. You need to see what's going on, and if you see what's going on, it sees you too. So it's like hunting. If you get close enough to see the deer in the eye, he sees you too. You're not sneaking up on him. So the glasses allow you to actually get in there real close, blow the dust out, and pay attention to what you're doing. Even a circular saw, it should have a fan blowing forward. It doesn't always work well. And so you need to get in there and blow, but you can't get in there if you don't have glasses on. It's just, I mean, even though we say you got to have glasses all the time, if you hide, okay, you can get away with it. But if you actually want to see what you're doing and do a careful job, you've got to get the glasses on. Anybody have any experience, new experience with a chisel? The chisel was fine when you're cutting out that plywood and no sweat? Anybody hit their hand with the hammer? No? Yeah, one confession, I love this. Okay. Oh, speaking of that, did you see the newspaper? Did everybody see the newspaper today? Have you all seen the newspaper today? No? You want to pass the newspaper back up here for a moment? Front page. Front page, guys.
We're on the front page?
Yeah. Isn't that cool?
Where'd you find that paper?
He brought them to school.
Oh, okay, yeah. Like, I was wondering if you guys got one stuff, they're still stocking those little machines around town. Yeah, do they really? Wow. I love it.
Okay. The chisel is a tool that is not appreciated very well. In fact, Robert, you want to bring me a chisel? And they come in different widths. Bring a couple of them out, Robert. And they come in different widths. The standard one is straight and flat. That's what we were working with. They have all kinds of curves and different shapes for doing different things. But in terms of using the chisel, it has two different surfaces. One is flat right off the bottom, and the other is a bevel. So it's not like a knife that comes together in a point from two sides. So your pocket knife will be sharpened on both sides. But a chisel is flat on one. Well, try to keep these things, these little protectors, because even if one is just digging around your toolbox, if you meet a chisel, that makes a cut. And two is that the chisel gets chipped, like this one's getting kind of all chipped up. So you need to learn to sharpen chisels too. But they come in all kinds of different widths and then that profile. And this is your standard straight chisel. Now you do have other ones for making curve, bowl shape slots and things like that. Yesterday, we used the chisel in a muscle fashion, which is we put it in and we whacked it, and it's made to be whacked. And the one thing that I hope you learned is that if you hold it down here, you got better control, but you can whack your hand worse because your hand gets stuck, gets slammed against the wood. So we hold it high. But when you go into the wood, the back side will go in clean, and the front side will make, the bevel side will make a dent. So if you need it clean, you got to put it in the wood right. If you put it in backwards, you get a dent on your good side of the wood. And you got to really learn that. So it's got to move around like that as you're going. Now, one other thing is that if you're using a chisel, we can use a chisel to take and change this little edge. If you wanted to take that off and not have it so round, you could go like this with the bevel up here, but it's hard to control. You control it by the bevel. The more I tip like this, the deeper it goes, the shallower, and then at one point it just slides without cutting. So I lift the handle and it starts to cut. The really control for doing a thing like this is to take the chisel, not straight on, but on an angle, and slide it on the flat face. Why? Because the angle is like a slice. As opposed to straight in, it's just like butting in and you need a hammer. But with the slice, you get it. And sometimes we actually work like that, is we'll take a chisel and we'll push it sideways to make it cut. So if we're coming in on this and we shove it down, all of a sudden it's this thumb that's doing all the work and getting in there. So when you learn little things like that, it means that instead of having to get sandpaper out or something to do an edge, you can grab a chisel and you can chamfer an edge really quickly. Okay, so some of the simplest tools will do things that we could do with a router. We could do it with a lot of fancy tools, but you can get them done. And it's in your toolbox. You've always got one. You just got to keep it sharp. And that's another thing as you're slowly building up your toolbox is you want to get sharpening stones or a grinding stone or something and do some studying of sharpening as you're going along. So the chisel is actually, I think I seduced my wife with the chisel. You like that? Is that I was working in my workshop. I actually met her. You'd love my wife. She's a tiny little thing. Now she's 73, but she's a tiny little thing. When I met her, she was in a leotard, just knocked dead, tiny little thing, on a trapeze. Okay? She was the first trapezist in the Cirque du Soleil. The very first that they ever had. And I said, wow, I'm in Quebec, I'm staying. Okay. But where she came and dropped by my woodworking shop one night, and I was building a hardwood set of doorways for a bar that needed an outside entrance, you know, a little snow cabin before you get into the bar, but he wanted it fancy. So it was all mortise and tenon, like the Japanese stuff. And so I had my chisel and my hammer, and when you really get into that, it gets that you make, I don't have a hammer here, but that's all right. You make a note, you get, that sets the chisel in the right place, then you, little taps, you set it more, and then you hit it. Then you move it, then you go tap, 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 tap. It's like the drum corps. She dropped by my shop, I didn't see her there. And for half an hour she stood there and watched me making these mortises. And so the holes for the tenon to go down in this thing. And she said, I didn't think you knew music. I said, I don't know. This is the only music I know. That's the only music I know, but it does it around. But you'll learn, if you get into a rhythm of something, it works so much smoother. If I just go tap, 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 it doesn't work the same as getting it in the right place, making sure it's in the right place, setting it, and then whacking it. And you don't need to whack it 5 times. You just whack it, it moves down. I got to move over a little bit and get the rest of it and get the wood out and all of that stuff. But it really can be enjoyable working with wood like that. And who knows, you may impress somebody if you know how to do that. Okay? What else are we working with? The coping saw, as I told you yesterday, is a tool that we rarely use, although it was made for this very specific purpose of coping out the trim board here. Now, what some of you got into a little bit, and you needed to know more if you really want to use the coping saw, is to get used to the fact that it has 2 wings on it. And I can put the blade in that direction, or I can put the blade in that direction. I can put the teeth the other direction. You can move it all over. I can even turn it around and have it cut on the inside so that I pull it back out of a hole as you're coming around. But the advantage of that is that you can get it, because we're always with coping saw getting into something where we're getting into trouble hitting the table or hitting something else. So instead of fighting that, it's quick. Once you understand, you just release it, move it, tighten it, and go again. With many, many tools, that little step is important. Release, adjust, tighten, and go again. What workmen do far too often, and particularly craftsmen, the difference between workman and craftsman is the workman's doing structure, heavy-duty stuff. He measures to a 1/16 of an inch. A craftsman is measuring much finer and doing good joints, and it's got to look good. What the carpenter needs to do is make it solid, so it doesn't wobble and it's going to stay put. The finish worker or the cabinet maker has got to get in much more detail and get it to fit down there, okay? So by adjusting things, even the table saw, if it needs to get a little higher or a little lower, just stop and do that. If you need an angle, you stop and do it. Don't try to lift your wood and cut the angle.